Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the ADMS Compliance Webinar Wednesday for today, November 30th, 2016. The Office of Compliance and Regulatory Affairs for Atlantic Dialysis Management Services is comprised of the following individuals: William Cundiff, Ricardo Sime, and Alexander Osorio. And we thank you today for your time in joining us for this month's presentation. First off, we'd like to begin with congratulations to our 2016 Compliance Advocates Awards. Our awardees this year from Newtown Dialysis was Danielle Faye Bobo, social worker. From Ridgewood Dialysis was our nurse care coordinator, Biljana. Also an awardee was Central Park Dialysis, medical director, Dr. Joji Takita. At New Hyde Park, our awardee was Marlon Mendoza. At East End Dialysis, we recognize as our compliance advocate Beth Woods, social worker. And we also recognize from the ADMS College Point IT department our own Peter Action Jackson as compliance advocate. So we thank everyone, and we thank you all within the organization for ensuring quality, ethics, and good conduct. So thank you, everyone. First off, we'd like to thank Atlantic Dialysis Management Services Human Resources Department for their time in reviewing and providing input in today's presentation on the exclusionary list and dealing with excluded individuals and excluded entities. And this is an important topic both in the back office operations in terms of how we're able to conduct business as an organization and entity, and at the same time how this applies to you as individual employees, not only here, but in other healthcare workplaces if you happen to work in any of those or will work in those in the future. So today we'll explain the impact of not understanding what exclusion means and what happens if Atlantic Dialysis or any of its contracted affiliates employs, contracts, or does business with individuals or entities are considered to be excluded. In addition, we'll explain more about the exclusion program, what it addresses, the processes by which we can determine whether or not an individual entity has been excluded, and then give you an opportunity to ask any questions or answers. In the lower right-hand column of your GoToMeeting box, which you may see on your screen, there is the ability to type in a question. So later on in the presentation, we'll ask you if you have any questions. We'll take some questions and give you some answers, and I'll also open up the phone lines, which are currently muted, to give you an opportunity to ask some questions directly, and we'll attempt to answer those. So the basic rule on exclusion. So what does exclusion mean? And exclusion means that neither the federal or state government programs, Medicare or Medicaid, will make any payments to any healthcare provider for any items or services furnished, ordered, or prescribed by an excluded individual or entity. And we'll talk about what excluded is momentarily. So essentially, the government will not make a payment either from Medicare or Medicaid or any of the Advantage programs to a healthcare provider or an administrative services organization by any individual or entity who's found to be excluded. And these include items or services that a doctor may order. These include whether billing is done either separately or in a bundled payment, and also includes any administrative or management services that's not related to patient care, like those services provided by Atlantic Dialysis Management Services, which is a services organization contracted by the dialysis centers. So what's the rules on exclusion? Well, exclusion is real key. Exclusion means that an individual, a personal individual, such as an employee, a doctor or nurse, or an entity, could be excluded from participating in either a federal or state healthcare program if they're convicted of a crime like patient abuse, if someone within the billing or collections department submits a false or fraudulent claim. Okay, there's a difference between false and fraudulent, so we'll talk about that as well. Or we submit a claim for payment on behalf during a period of exclusion where an individual, an employee, a vendor, a credentialed member, or a consultant is employed. So if we're sending in a bill to any federal or state health care program, such as Medicare or Medicaid, the child health grants, block grants to the state, or the CHIP program, and there are individuals excluded, and these could be entities, corporations, partnership, PCs, okay, we are not going to be paid for those services. Now, you may say, what's the big deal? And we'll learn more about that in the next slide. So, once we find that an individual or an organization has been excluded, the dialysis centers, the physician practices, the physician offices, Atlantic Dialysis Management Services cannot employ, cannot contract with, could not allow or permit them to take any ordering of any services or deliver any services of supplies, undertake any administrative duties, conduct any reviews, whether or not it's involved directly in direct care activities. So an example would be if there's a member of the ADMS Revenue Cycle Insurance Verification Team who's found to be excluded, that individual could not be hired, could not be employed by Atlantic Dialysis. If it is found that a cleaning contractor that we contract with to perform cleaning services in one of the dialysis centers, and that contractor has an excluded employee, whether or not that person works within the Atlantic Dialysis family or works somewhere else, once it is found that that contractor has an excluded employee on its payroll, we would have to terminate that contract. In our agreements with vendors, this language should be present. Or an example may be if there's a nurse practitioner, a direct healthcare patient provider who is providing services, and it's found that that individual has been excluded from participating in either the federal and or state program for a healthcare fraud that maybe he or she committed, that individual could not be employed or could not be credentialed. They would need to be terminated or their privileges revoked immediately. It's not a discussable item. It's not a notification issue. It's not something that can happen next week. It happens to happen immediately. So let's talk about the exclusion status. So Atlantic Dialysis Management Services, Matu Medical Associates PC, Matu Medical Associates Acute Division, the dialysis centers in general, are all charged by law with knowing the exclusion status of all employees, all credentialed staff, and all contractors. Under the New York State Office of the Medicaid Inspector General, those regulations state that there's an affirmative duty by the Human Resource Departments and the compliance offices of healthcare facilities to check the status of individuals and entities on a pre-hire and pre-contract basis, and then on a regular basis thereafter. So before an employee goes on board, aside from the regular background check, each individual goes through a review through the 4 exclusionary databases, which indicates, again, whether someone has been convicted of a healthcare fraud, a crime against patient, or other certain level felonies. Not only employees, but also credentialed privileged staff, those individuals, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, research team members, doctors who are applying for privileges, credentialing privileges at the dialysis centers or nephrology practice, those individuals are also checked through the exclusionary list databases. Those, again, based upon the regulations from New York State, are to be done on a pre-hire basis. No one should be engaged and hired and on your floor in your center unless those exclusionary checks have already been completed and has been confirmed that they are clear. Okay, right now all these databases are not super secretive. They are available online. Basic Google search will say something along the lines of exclusionary list, and you will see the 4 or 5 databases from the federal or state government. So with the easy access, we're unable to make an argument to the federal or state government that said, we didn't know if the person was excluded. It's that simple. So you have to ensure, if you're a hiring manager, if you're the purchasing manager, if you're the facilities contract officer here, if it's any of the hiring of the physician practice managers, you have to ensure that any individual, whether employee, vendor, consultant, contractor, credentialed privileged staff, have an exclusionary list check before they're either engaged or start. In addition, we run background checks on every current employee on a regular basis, which is the definition under the OMEG, New York State Medicaid Inspector General rules. There was a question as to what the definition of regularly was. What we have learned is that the standard definition for regular is monthly. So every month, the ADMS Compliance Office, in assistance with the ADMS Payroll Department, the Purchasing Department, and the Accounts Payable Department, thank you, gentlemen, provide the Compliance Office with a list of individuals, organizations, entities, and credentialed privileged staff, and we conduct background checks to the exclusionary list for all of these individuals. To date, we have found individuals who have been excluded, and we needed to take remedial action effective immediately to address the issue, and we'll talk about that again in a little while. Okay. So what are the consequences if we do business with someone who's excluded? What's the big deal? Well, here's how it impacts your dialysis center. This is how it impacts ADMS College Point Corporate. This is how it impacts the nephrology practice. For any provider who employs or contracts an individual or entity that's been excluded, there are penalties for up to $10,000 for each item or each service furnished by that person. In addition to that, there is a fine of 3 times the amount claimed. So if there are line items claimed, such as there is a nurse excluded at Ridgewood Dialysis Center that we're unaware of for whatever the reason is, for each treatment that nurse was working, for whatever day she was scheduled to work, and for whatever number of treatments occurred during the time she was working after she was excluded, for each treatment there would be a $10,000 fine. In addition to that, for each bill that went out from the ADMS revenue cycle for each treatment in which that nurse was working, there would be a penalty for up to 3 times that amount. In addition to that, if it is found that either the Ridgewood Dialysis Management was negligent, the ADMS Human Resource Department was negligent, the ADMS Compliance Office was negligent, the dialysis center could be excluded in its entirety from participating in either Medicare or Medicaid program, which essentially would be closing the door and locking the door. The dialysis center would be out of business. So you need to ensure, folks, there are severe financial penalties for your inability or your negligence in not checking to make sure your employees, your vendors, and your consultants are engaged. Okay. So what's the easy compliance rule? Well, we start with the basic 10-foot pole, and everyone knows that rule. I wouldn't touch him or her with a 10-foot pole. So before you engage someone, before you extend an offer to an employee, make sure that on a pre-hire basis or on a pre-offer basis, these background checks have been completed. For clinical folks, we would also recommend that you also look at the clinical practitioner applicant's National Practitioner Data Bank report and make sure that there's nothing there that's going to alert you to either exclusion or litigation-related items. So again, best case approach, use common sense. If you're not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole, use that rule. Now, I can hear our hiring managers right now saying, oh, but she's so important to our patients. They like her. Do we really have to let her go? And our response is, maybe so, but you need to be prepared for the consequences. Those of you who had a recent governing body training session a few weeks ago learned about something called the Yates Memorandum, which came out in 2015. And what the Yates Memorandum states is that any individual who is a manager, a director, a supervisor within an entity, and either is neglectful or negligent in supervising for items such as fraud, waste, abuse, or things along these lines, the federal government and the state government will come after that individual manager personally. They're not going to come after the dialysis center or Atlantic Dialysis or the nephrology practice. They are going to come after William Cundiff as an individual. Again, ADMS Human Resource Department employees conduct exclusionary list background checks on all potential employees. If you are the hiring manager, please ensure that exclusionary lists, compliance checks, and or MPDBs, if applicable, are run pre-hire, pre-offer. So reinstatement. Let's assume, because things do happen, there are identification issues, there are names that are the same, or things that get corrected. For whatever the reason is, someone understands, you know what, I was excluded, but you know what, there's reasons, and they're able to reinstate. They can be reinstated. Excluded individuals can be reinstated, but the problem is they cannot be reinstated into the workplace, so you can't take someone back, such as a doctor who was excluded under Section 1128A1 was excluded for a period of 5 years. He or she could be reapply for participation again after 120 days before that 5-year period expires. So at 4 years and 6 months, they could reapply That means you cannot engage or hire that individual until that time. Same thing as the nurse. A nurse who's excluded under Section 1128B4 can apply for restatement, but once that license has been returned to an active status by the New York State Licensing Board, as an example. So you can't bring anyone on board once they say, okay, we're good. You have to get a reinstatement, whether based upon their certification coming in place, their license coming in place, or with respect to a credentialed doctor, 6 months before the expiration of that period they were excluded. Okay? With respect to reinstatement, if you found you're on the exclusionary list and we notify you, and we advise you, unfortunately, we've got to terminate your services, what you as an individual or what you as an entity need to do is you have to write a written request for reinstatement to the entity or the organization that excluded you, Health and Human Services, the General Services Administration, the contracting system, or New York State Office of Medicaid Inspector General. You have to submit a written request. Then that individual also has to submit then an application, and then you have to sign an authorization. And that authorization will allow the Inspector General to contact an employer such as yourself. The Inspector General's office within the federal or state agency will then conduct an investigation based on the information you provide, and be aware that the average processing time for reinstatement or review of that application could be as long as 6 months. So reinstatement process is bearish, so prepare. Some of the items we look at from an exclusionary list, and here are some of the databases we check to, and these are web-based systems, so you can go on your own on a pre-hire basis and look at individuals. If you look, you have the exclusionary program. This is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. If you were to click on online searchable databases, and these are updated real-time daily, you would click on that, and that would bring you to a screen in which you would enter the name of the entity or information. So you would see a last name. You would see the first name. You would enter the business name, Joe's Snow Removal, and then you would click search, and you would get a report. The report will either tell you no items found, or it's going to give you a series of matches. In the situation where Atlantic Dialysis identifies that there is a match of a name, it does a further level of background checks, and it checks to tax identification numbers, TIN, EINs. It checks to Social Security numbers. It checks to date of births. It checks to make sure that the same gender, the person excluded is a male, but the person we have on our list is a female. So we do a number of series of background checks before we identify the ownership groups, the respective governing body groups, or human resources. More importantly, these searches are conducted confidentially. If an individual is found, there are no memorandums that go broad stroke throughout the world in the universe in ADMS that say, this person has been excluded, this person is found. These items are kept confidential, just like other systematic reports. So that's Health and Human Services. If you go under the Inspector General, I believe this is, pardon me, this is the New York State Office of Medicaid Inspector General. My apologies for the screenshot. And you'll see here there's this search tab, OMEG, New York State OMEG. And you would click the searchable database, and that will cover those individuals and entities that have been excluded by New York State based upon crimes at the state level. New York's, the federal government under the General Services Administration has a system for award management, and these are entities, individuals who have been given contracts by the General Services Administration of the federal government. And in this situation, you can also do a search for those. So we do 4 different searches. So you will click on this, Excluded Parties List, the EPLS, and again, you would enter a last name, a first name, and a vendor or consultant's name, and based upon what comes up would give us need to act or not a need to act. Then you would come to the General Inspector General's website, and this gives you an exclusionary list item. And again, you would search a last name and or a first name. If you want to look for entity or multiple entities, you would enter that there. Again, a web-based system, as you can see, OIG.HHS.gov, and you would click search, and again, you'd get a report. Either you would get a matching report or a non-matching report. After we conduct these reports, we don't sit back and say, well, that was nice. What we do is Alexander Osorio in the ADMS Compliance Office, after running the reports with information again from ADMS Payroll, ADMS Purchasing and Facilities, ADMS Accounts Payable Department, reviews it with the Compliance Office, and then we send out memorandums to the appropriate ownership groups, the physician owners, the governing bodies, and human resources. And this is an example for the September, and this is for the credentialed staff. We do a memorandum for each location for the credentialed privileged staff in each dialysis center. And this would be all those physicians, PAs, NPs, research staff members who are in your dialysis center or practice areas. And the memorandum talks to the searches we've conducted, what we used, where we got the information used to conduct the search, and whether or not there were any findings or not findings made. So we do one for credentialed staff. Then we do one for the employee searches, and these are true employees of the organization. And again, this will go to the respective 13 governing body groups, including the facility administrators / center compliance officers. And we will check it again to Health and Human Services, the System for Award Management. We will check it to the Office of Inspector General, and we'll give a list of those searches conducted, where the information came from that we used, who provided it. In this case, you'll see, I believe it mentions Assistant Controller Frank Vanakat, and whether or not there were any findings for employees. Then we'll do vendors and consultants, and this is from information provided by the accounting group. Abraham Thomas and his group will provide us a list of all vendors provided to Atlantic, to Matuambot Medical Associates PC, Matuambot Medical Associates Acute Division, the respective dialysis centers. For every vendor, every consultant engaged, we will conduct a background check on each vendor to any of the exclusionary lists. Again, where that information came from, and you'll see we do mention Accounts Payable Supervisor Thomas Abraham, and whether or not there are any findings. In addition, the ADMS Purchasing Department and the ADMS Facility Department, prior to engaging any new vendor, consultants, or contractors, runs a background check through the ADMS Compliance Office through the exclusionary list. We want to ensure that no contractor or vendor is being engaged who should not be engaged. So Rich Italiagambe, Eddie Taporo, and of course Taha Rashed bring us that list of individuals before, and we will check those prospective vendors to the exclusionary list and the tax ID numbers. For more information, or to schedule a live presentation at your location, or to discuss any part of the compliance program that we've learned about this year, that we've discussed today, or about the Code of Conduct, please contact the ADMS Compliance Officer, William Cundiff, at 718-483-7428. In addition, I want to remind everyone here, and please remind your friends and family, that the required compliance training that every member needs to complete is coming soon. Beginning next Thursday, December 8th, to December 19th, you have 12 days to complete your annual required compliance training. It is required. So beginning December 8th to December 19th, the online compliance training will be effective. We're finalizing it now with the IT department so everyone has access, and you will be able to view it. Those managers and individuals, please remember that compliance training is required for all credentialed clinical staff and employees. As Sammy says on the screen right now, this means you. So nurse administrators, facility managers, compliance officers, please remember all credentialed clinical staff and all employees are required. At this time, I'm going to open up the phone lines and unmute the phones for any questions. If you're watching it on your screen and you'd like, feel free to type any question in the lower right-hand corner. But I'll unmute the phone right now if you wish, and anyone with any questions, feel free to ask. And thank you. Anyone with any questions at this point? Anyone on the phone lines with any questions? Well, I want to thank everyone today for coming. I appreciate it. If anyone has any questions or comments, please let us know. Just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the ADMS website on the Compliance Division. So check the website in a few days. It shall be posted. And again, we want to thank everyone for joining us today and have a great day. Thank you.